As we make our way towards the end of Season 1, we also move closer to a brand new arc. This transition brings with it a lot of exposition, including elements and mechanics of the legendary weapons that weren't mentioned in the anime. Not only that, but in this episode we see a lot of events involving each of the 4 heroes as they make their first steps towards working together. So let's continue our Shield Hero Cut content series and take a look at what the anime left out this time. Episode 22, 4 Heroes Council, covering chapters 33 to 34 from the manga and the prologue of volume 5 in the light novel. Here we find Raphtalia and Philo in front of the Dragon Hourglass about to perform the class-up ceremony. Not only was the queen there to spectate, but also the former king, aka Trash. Trash was there as well because the queen was still in the middle of torturing him. Having him spectate the shield hero and his party do the very thing that he wanted to prevent was all part of the punishment. You see, the queen hadn't known that Trash had forbidden Naofumi and his party from taking part in the class-up ceremony. So this just added to the already numerous things that she was mad at him for. She encased him in a block of ice all the way up to his neck, brought him to the Dragon Hourglass, and forced him to watch the ceremony to its completion. Naofumi could tell that this prideful king didn't enjoy it one bit, but he couldn't really find any amusement from it either. Don't get me wrong though, it's not like he pitied him, he just thought that they should have exiled him instead. Though, given the king's far-reaching connections, that probably would have led to bigger problems down the road. Anyway, the Hourglass room was a little bit different. Normally, nuns would be seen standing on either side of the hourglass, yet now there was none to be found. Not a single follower of the priest was left in the church. Turns out, every single one of them was arrested for supporting the enemy. Now, Philo was the first to take part in the class-up ceremony. She first rested her hand on the hourglass, which caused the sand to begin to ripple and emit a slight glow. That glow would soon become a bright light that would not only fill the hourglass but also envelop Philo. An icon matching Philo's symbol popped up into Naofumi's field of view, branching out to many different paths, showing numerous options that Naofumi could choose for her. Now, you may be wondering why the choice was given to Naofumi and not Philo. Well, that's because Philo is technically his monster, and as such, he's given complete authority over the paths she can take. Of course, Naofumi knew that this wasn't his choice to make. It was something both Philo and Raphtalia needed to choose on their own, especially if they were going to be happy after he leaves them. So he rejects the rights to choose Philo's path and transfers complete control to her. He then tells Raphtalia that she'll have to make the same choice. Even though she says she'd be fine with whatever path Naofumi chooses for her, Naofumi still insisted that she had to choose on her own. She was a little disheartened by this, but Naofumi couldn't stand the thought of choosing something that he or she would later regret. Philo finally decided on what she wanted, and after trying to select it, her cowlick began to glow ever so brightly, until eventually becoming a blinding light that would swallow the entire room. It was only for a moment though, and after the brief flash, Philo didn't really look any different except for having a more prominent cowlick. What did change was her stats that now showed significant improvement. You probably didn't notice in the anime, but every single one of Philo's stats essentially doubled. This was pretty exceptional, especially considering that a good class-up typically provided a boost of only 50%. But Philo wasn't quite ecstatic by this. In fact, she was rather disappointed because she really wanted to pick a path that would let her spit poison. However, when she readied that path for selection, something else had pushed it away and picked a different one. It was a ridiculous path to want to go on, but still her path nonetheless. Raphtalia was up next, and when she finished choosing a path, Philo's cowlick began to glow once more. It then split into two, broke off of Philo's head and flew straight towards Naofumi. On impact, it caused another bright light to engulf the room, except this time there formed a giant column of smoke. The event itself was much different than what had happened with Philo, but somehow the outcome remained the same. Although their stats had pretty much doubled, bringing all of them except for defense to a level greater than Naofumi's, they both didn't get to choose the paths they felt was best. The queen had no idea how this was possible, so Naofumi could only assume that it had something to do with Vittoria. Of course, he could never be quite sure. Now, Raphtalia and Philo weren't quite yet stuck with the path they had chose. You see, there also existed a different ceremony, one that would reset their levels back to 1. But with that came a complete wipe of all the progress that they had made. So if they were truly upset with the path that they were given, then they could start from square one and grind it out all over again. Naofumi thought about it, but he wasn't really a fan of wasting the time that they had already invested, so he decided against it. Philo was visibly upset, but Raphtalia was rather accepting since she really had no idea how she wanted to progress anyway. All she wanted was to become stronger. Whatever path that looked like, well, she didn't really care. The three then took a carriage back to the castle, where a massive feast was being prepared, a celebration for the proper resolution of such a big conflict. When guests from all over began to arrive, so much food had been laid out that it made the scraps that Naofumi was used to look like a joke. Philo immediately got busy having her fill, resembling Raphtalia at the time when she had been given her first meal. It made Naofumi look over to see if she was still the same way. She didn't seem nearly as interested as she used to be, barely eating anything at all. Something seemed to be bothering her, and he wondered what that was. But before he could get an answer, Raphtalia decides to ask a question of her own. She wanted to know what type of girl Naofumi liked. It was a completely unprecedented and random question, but the thought was now out there, and it made Naofumi think about an answer. Currently, there wasn't really any type of girl he liked. In fact, just thinking about it made him remember the whole mine situation. So, unable to give a straight answer, Raphtalia rephrases it and asks if there was a girl he was waiting for back in his own world. Raphtalia likely thought that this was the reason he wanted to return home. Unfortunately, that couldn't be farther from the truth. The real reason was rather simple. Naofumi hated this world. He hated what he was forced to go through, and he hated the people because of it. Of course, he couldn't just tell Raphtalia that he hated her world. Instead, all he could come up with was that he simply wanted to leave. Nothing more and nothing less. The heroes were then gathered by the queen for a meeting. Initially, Motoyasu wasn't there because he was with Mine at the hospital. You see, Mine had tried to poison Naofumi's food, but was told to sample it before giving it to him, resulting in her having to be sent to the hospital. So for now, it was only Itsuki, Ren, and Naofumi. The first topic of discussion was the double XP event at the Kaomira Islands, with the queen giving them full permissions to take part in the activation event. The next topic was a little more touchy because the queen wanted everyone to become more acquainted with each other. At first, they were pretty hesitant, but eventually they were swayed towards doing so. So the queen had them start out by introducing their party members. Itsuki went first, and he showcased his bodyguard known as Flashy Armor. This guy. He seemed rather polite, but it wasn't until he started scolding another party member that his true colors began to show. He was scolding a young girl by the name of Licia who took too long to bring his food. The thing about Licia though is that she didn't fit at all with the other party members. She lacked that same aura of self-confidence that the others seemed to emit. Naofumi thought that she was likely one of the party's magic users, otherwise she probably wouldn't be kept around. Anyway, everyone except for Flashy Armor looked to be decent people. Something about that one guy made Naofumi feel like he was being discriminated against. When he brought it to Itsuki's attention, the complaint was just disregarded, but even Ren felt like they weren't being treated as they should. We soon find out that Flashy Armor thought that they were inferior to his master Itsuki, both in power and accomplishment. Ren wasn't too happy by that statement. He looked as if he was about to draw his sword. Itsuki had to step in and calm everything down, ordering Flashy Armor to show a bit more respect. For now, he obliged. Next was Ren's party. There were 4 in total, and each of them showed much more respect than Itsuki's party. Something about them seemed off though. Although they were extremely polite, they were visibly nervous around Naofumi. That's when one confronted him, and bowed apologetically for how the former king had treated him, saying that if he had known what was going to happen then he would have aligned himself with the shield hero from the beginning. The other members followed suit and apologized as well. Naofumi was a little thrown off by their modesty, but he was very happy to accept their apologies. The members then turned to Ren and asked what their next task would be. Ren mentioned the Kaomira event, and told them that they would follow the usual routine. A routine where Ren would do some solo leveling while the rest of the party fought together against monsters that would be best for their growth. It was a weird way of getting experience, but it was what Ren and his party were used to. Naofumi could sense a bit of disconnect though. There seemed to be some distance between Ren and his party. I mean, they took his words positively, but under that positivity seemed a bit of irritation. In any case, it was now Naofumi's turn. He introduced Raphtalia and Philo in a fairly standard way, and both replied about as well as you'd expect them to. Itsuki decided that he wanted to ask Raphtalia a couple of questions, focusing mostly on her relationship with Naofumi. Essentially, he wanted to make sure that Raphtalia wasn't being forced to fight. Given that it was a master-slave relationship, he wasn't sure whether Raphtalia was fighting of her own free will or not. The more questions he asked, the more irritated Naofumi got. It was as if he was trying to get a complaint out of her. Of course, Raphtalia's resolve shined through, and she told Itsuki that she fights because she wants to, not because she's forced to. Itsuki had no choice but to take her at her word. So, with all the parties now introduced, it was time for the heroes to discuss amongst themselves, bringing us to the round table room that we see in the anime. Motoyasu had finally made his way back from the hospital, looking quite visibly disgruntled. For some reason, he still continued to blame Naofumi for everything that happened to Mine. However, this wasn't the best time to bicker about it. The queen had more important things that she wanted to discuss. She started as blunt as ever, stating how all of them except for Naofumi will likely die if they don't step up their game. Apparently, the other nations seemed to doubt their survivability given their performance against the priest. Itsuki and Ren chalked it up to the shield being overpowered, and they demanded to know why that was. But Naofumi wasn't just going to give them that information for free. He requested they tell him something useful first, then maybe he'd share his own secrets. Initially, they refused. They seemed to have this mentality that they were doing fine up until now. Like, they couldn't acknowledge the fact that they had lost to Glass or the priest. Their stubbornness made Naofumi realize that they still just saw this whole thing as a game. It was as if they believed that even if they did lose, they would just be able to wake up back in the hospital and try again. I mean, because that's what's been happening already, they didn't seem to acknowledge the fact that they could die. They even thought that killing Naofumi would only send him back to the real world. So, to Naofumi, these other heroes were practically insane, and their mindset didn't seem as if it was going to be changing anytime soon. Eventually, they did reach a middle ground. They agreed that in order to save the world, they should probably start cooperating at least a little bit. The first tips they shared were on the copy and crafting tools innate to their weapons. Then came the ability to automatically get a monster's dropped items by simply absorbing a piece of that monster. Since Naofumi had been manually collecting them the entire time, this would be a significant time saver in the post-battle process. Next, they identified areas that were efficient for leveling at different level ranges, which quickly led to the argument about what makes for the strongest weapons. Itsuki believed it to be weapon rarity, Ren thought it to be all based on level, and Motoyasu said it boiled down to a combination of skill mastery and smelting. Each hero seemed to have their own method of getting stronger weapons, yet none could agree on the same one. The only common element was that pieces of monsters had to be absorbed in order for anything to happen. They were each adamant about their method since that's what they knew worked. It also didn't help that it was the mechanic that matched the game that they were most familiar with. The thing about each of these though is that none of them seemed like a viable method for Naofumi. He also had a different means to make his weapon stronger, and none of the features that the other heroes mentioned were available to him. So in the end, they could only agree to disagree, coming up with the temporary conclusion that each legendary weapon is powered up differently. It was now Naofumi's turn to talk a bit about his own secrets. The other heroes were most curious about how Philo and Raftalia became so strong. To them, their power was so exceedingly OP that they thought it to be some kind of cheat. So he gave them a bit of background but only told them what they needed to know, nothing more. Mainly keeping it about shield variants that made leveling monsters and slaves easier, making sure to leave out any information on Vittoria. That was enough information to get the other heroes to start talking again, and they decided to bring up the topic of teleportation, another innate ability to the weapons but only available after level 50. At the time, Naofumi was only level 43, which explains why he didn't know anything about the teleportation variant of his shield. It also meant that he was at least 7 levels lower than the other heroes, which was pretty surprising considering how much stronger than them he already was. But knowing that fast travel was a real thing was even more surprising, and the only material needed to activate it was sand from the Dragon Hourglass. The other heroes then proposed another question to Naofumi. They wanted to know how his shield was able to deal damage. To them, the only shielders they've ever known were all defensive tanks, ones that were incapable of doing anything other than taking aggro and soaking up damage. They thought Naofumi must have used some kind of cheat or talked to God in order to gain access to both an offensive and defensive weapon. Naofumi decided that it would be best to tell them about the Curse series, explaining the sequence of events that resulted in its birth and how to activate it. He also mentioned that they wouldn't be able to handle it given how immature they were, but that didn't really matter since they didn't seem to believe him anyway. I mean, they tried looking for a reference to it in the help menu, but couldn't find a single mention, making them think that Naofumi was just telling lies. Clearly there was still a lot of work to be done towards the trust department. Anyway, that was about as much as anyone could get from each other before they broke out into argument again, thus concluding the meeting. When all was said and done, Naofumi had a lot on his mind. He recorded in detail each of the ways that the heroes said that they got stronger. Then he thought about his own method of growth. All that thought eventually led to the idea that maybe these legendary weapons reflect the heart of its user. For Naofumi, the Curse Shield didn't appear until he thought he lost Philo. And since each of the heroes have differing stories themselves, perhaps the weapons are actively changing to adapt into the optimal tool for the wielder based on their beliefs. Giving it a try, Naofumi decides to imagine that there was in fact a section for item drops and weapon copying. Sure enough, a menu opened in his field of vision and he could see the drops from every monster he'd ever fought ever. There was definitely a ton of garbage in the list, but also a few valuables in between. When one was selected, the item would then materialize from his shield. This was a significant revelation because now he had a new inventory tool at his disposal, as well as an absurd number of materials to craft with. But more than anything, this showed that belief was a significant factor in determining what the legendary weapons were capable of. Now Fumi realized that his own fear of being tricked was a detriment to his own growth. But now he saw that there was nothing to lose in trying. So he decides to try and believe in Itsuki's description on how to make weapons stronger. This involving combining weapons with certain ores in order to raise its power. And just like with the item list, a power-up menu randomly appeared in his view. Now Fumi was ecstatic. He just proved that the shield's capabilities are partially based on his own beliefs. He decides to extensively test not only this method, but also the other heroes' methods as well. And while they did in fact work to significantly improve each of his shields, this topic is a bit more complex and isn't even touched on in the anime. So I'll be covering these unique aspects of weapon leveling and growth as a separate topic in its own video. It'll also serve to close out this episode. For now though, just know that we're entering a period that transitions us into the next arc. And that will lead us to a time skip of like 5 volumes in episode 25. So I'll continue this series up till episode 24, then wait a bit for season 2 to start before resuming it. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!